evaluating the law enforcement response to the Uvalde school massacre. This report was shared with CNN by a family member of a Robb Elementary student. The full report is expected to be released later today. CNN's Shimon Prokupecz has been working the story from the beginning. And Shimon, I can see you looking through the report right now. What are you learning?
Yeah, and John, and just to stress, we obtained this report from a family members who were allowed to pick it up this morning after their meeting last night with the Attorney General here behind me. And so this morning, the Department of Justice gave them the opportunity to pick up the report, and some of them are sharing the information with us. And as you said, one of the critical things in this report is that it highlights the failures of the police officers' leadership, the commanders of the different police departments that responded that morning essentially in their lack of leadership in taking control of the scene, giving instructions to officers, treating this situation like it was a barricaded situation, not an active shooter situation, despite the fact that there were several indications that there were children inside the classroom, that the gunman was still firing, they could hear the shots, and all of that should have made officers and the leadership on scene that day act, take charge, and go after the gunman and essentially kill him and try and rescue the people inside. Also, from what I've seen from this report, the Department of Justice really focuses on the victims here and the trauma that the community has experienced because of the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency, the way that they were treated here by officials, the lack of care for some of the victims on the day of the shooting, and the way that they were treated and handled, and really just a top to bottom failure in every way by law enforcement on that day, from their response to the way they treated the scene, the crime scene, the way they treated victims, what they did after the shooting ended, and also the communication here of the narrative that was initially put out by law enforcement, that this was some kind of heroic effort by officers who were on scene and officers who responded, and just days later, really, from tough questioning by reporters, that all unraveled. And essentially what we learned was that officers stood by for some 77 minutes as the gunman was allowed to remain inside that classroom. I can tell you, John, from talking to family members, they want more accountability. They are waiting for the local district attorney here to make a decision on criminal charges. They want criminal charges. It's unclear at this point if that's ever going to happen. And so now we wait for more news. We're going to hear from the Attorney General later today here at a press conference. We'll hear from family members again later on. But certainly, from what I've seen in this report, there are serious issues with the response by law enforcement on that day, as I said, from top to bottom. And it is a very damning report, certainly, but it is something that the family members here have been waiting for a very long time, and that is the most important part of this, because it is about the family members, and it is about the victims, and how they have been just mistreated and given no answers for now what is almost 2 years.
Shimon, I will never forget arriving there with you and you telling me the minute we got on the ground, something's not right here. Something is not right about what we're being told, what happened, and how police responded. So it's so interesting to me now that you're telling me that this federal report goes into the response to the response, because this is about the victims, this is about the families, and how they've been treated after, in many ways, this horrible massacre. You say there's some accountability here. Does this federal report name names and give an outline for maybe who or what is to blame?
Yeah, there is. They are naming names. They're naming the leadership that day, specifically the former now school police chief, Pete Arredondo, who really was sort of they say, based on their investigation, and really a lot of the investigation that we've done, that he was in charge of the scene that day, and that it was two other law enforcement officials. You had the sheriff, Nolasco, who was there that day, and then also the acting Uvalde police chief, Mariano Pargas. You know, all of these names, all of these individuals have been the subject of several reports that we here at CNN have done. In-depth analysis based on video we obtained, reports we obtained, all showing the lack of leadership, all showing the fact that they failed to take any kind of action on that day, despite knowing, hearing 911 calls, hearing that kids were inside that classroom, hearing from the husband of a teacher who was inside, telling them that his wife was inside, shot. So all of this this report takes everything that has been known, some new information, and puts it all together. It really just paints a ugly picture of the response, both that day, both after, and even to this day, of how this community has been treated. And the other thing, John, you know, I remember you and I standing outside that school the next morning. And remember, we did that lengthy interview with that Texas Department of Public Safety official who was the spokesperson. And he came to the scene and he started just talking to the media and offering all kinds of narratives of this heroic effort, that the police were here and they were there to rescue people. But days later, all of that started to unravel, and that was a big problem here because the family members in the community were just not getting answers, true answers, accurate answers, and that is something that they are still living with here in the community, and it has caused a major distrust. It has caused major trauma for this community.
It didn't add up. It just didn't add up. Shimon Prokupecz, stand by, if you will. Again, a lot of what we're seeing today is because of the questions you've been asking for so long. 2 years with us now, CNN law enforcement analyst Jonathan Wackrow. So, Jonathan, this is a federal report, the results of an investigation that's been going on for months and months and months here. A lot of what it finds is what we have come to know through reporting by Shimon and others here, that the law enforcement response was inadequate in many ways, just wrong. So what happens now with this?
Well, listen, we have to learn from it, right? We have to, take what we saw on that day, what is being reported now, and hold people accountable, right? And I think that, what Shimon's point, what he was trying to say here is that the re-victimization of this community happens again now, because this report is out without the accountability and holding people accountable for their either actions or lack of actions on that day just continues, the pain and suffering for this community, right? What we see in this report is no different than what we saw in the moments of the police response in all of Shimon's remarkable reporting afterwards, is that there was a complete failure across the board, right? And so that failure is the situational awareness. From the moment that those first calls came in, realizing that this was an active shooter situation, not a barricaded individual, right? That's failure number one. Communication, understanding the tactical control of responding officers and public safety officials to that site, maintaining an incident command structure. There were so many failures on that day, and for 77 minutes we watched as those failures compounded. And that's what this report outlines. Law enforcement has been taught for years, hundreds of thousands of hours of training go into hostile intruder, active shooter situation and what needs to be done. This is now a basic tenet of modern day policing. And what we saw was the exact contrast to that. We saw those widely adopted tactics around hostile intruder, active shooter essentially ignored. And that needs accountability. Those people who are making those decisions need to be held accountable for the 77 minutes of lack of action and the deaths that occurred because of that.
I don't want to oversimplify it, but what has become the way that law enforcement has been taught to deal with active shooters is basically you can't wait. You can't wait to go in.
No.
And what happened in Uvalde was the opposite of that.
John, the number one priority that every rookie police officer learns in the academy, and it's it reinforced through on-the-job training throughout their entire career. Number one priority in an active shooter situation is stop the killing in progress at all costs. Aggressive action by law enforcement is critical. You need to draw the gunfire away from innocent victims. Remember, law enforcement is going in with equipment, with tactics, with training, with knowledge of how to suppress that threat. Those innocent victims have nothing. You are the savior if you're that police officer. You have a moral and ethical responsibility to go in and at least draw the fire away and try to suppress that threat as quickly as possible. That force of action by law enforcement is critical to resolving this situation. When you don't, this is what you get for 77 minutes.
Hello and welcome guys, my another video. তো আমি যে টপিকটা নিয়ে আজকে আপনাদের সাথে শেয়ার করব সেটা হচ্ছে ফ্রিল্যান্সিং বিষয়ক একটা ভিডিও। এটা হচ্ছে ফ্রিল্যান্সিং একটা বিষয়ক একটা ভিডিও। আমি যদিও একটু বাইরে আছি, আজকে একটা মাঠের ভেতরে আছি। সো ফ্রিল্যান্সিং যারা করতে চান, ফ্রিল্যান্সিং সেক্টরের অনেক ওয়ে আছে যেগুলোর মাধ্যমে আপনারা ভালো একটা আর্নিং জেনারেট করতে পারেন। সো সেক্ষেত্রে আপনাকে অবশ্যই অনেক স্ট্রাগল করতে হবে, সে বিষয়গুলো বুঝতে হবে। আর বিশেষ করে ফোনের মাধ্যমে ফ্রিল্যান্সিং করা কোনোভাবেই পসিবল না। ফ্রিল্যান্সিং করতে হলে অবশ্যই একটা ল্যাপটপ অথবা কম্পিউটারের প্রয়োজন হয়। এবং যারা হলো বিভিন্ন ওয়েতে ইউটিউবের মাধ্যমে এবং বিভিন্ন ওয়েতে ফ্রিল্যান্সিং বিষয়ে অনেক ভিডিও বানায়, এগুলো আসলে ফেক। তারা আসলে ভিউজের জন্য এই কাজটা করে। সো আমার ভিডিওটা ভালো লাগলে অবশ্যই শেয়ার করবেন, লাইক করবেন, কমেন্ট করবেন। এবং ফ্রিল্যান্সিং বিষয়ে টিপস ট্রিক্স সবই দেওয়া হবে এই চ্যানেলে। সো আপনারা চ্যানেলটাকে ফলো করবেন, তাহলে ফ্রিল্যান্সিং বিষয়ে সব হলো ক্যাটাগরি সম্পর্কে জানতে পারবেন এবং ফুল টাইম সাপোর্ট পাবেন। তো ফ্রিল্যান্সিং শুরু করার প্রথম ওয়েটা হতে পারে আপনার হলো আপনি ডিজিটাল মার্কেটিং দিয়ে শুরু করতে পারেন। কারণ ডিজিটাল মার্কেটিং করলে আপনি হলো মানে ফ্রিল্যান্সিং বিষয়ের সব বিষয়ের উপর একটা ধারণা নিতে পারবেন। ফেসবুক, ইউটিউব, আদার্স সাইটগুলো সম্পর্কে ডিজিটাল মার্কেটিং থেকে আপনি ধারণা নিতে পারবেন। আপনি ইউটিউব প্ল্যাটফর্মে কাজ করতে পারেন এবং ইউটিউবের যে ক্যাটাগরিগুলো আছে, ইউটিউব চ্যানেল একটা চ্যানেল গ্রো করতে হলে কি করা লাগে এবং চ্যানেলের হলো মনিটাইজ কীভাবে আনবেন, বেশি ভিউ কীভাবে পাবেন, এগুলো সম্পর্কে অবশ্যই আপনাকে জানতে হবে এবং বুঝতে হবে। না বুঝলে কিছুই করতে পারবেন না। সো এই বিষয়গুলো মোস্ট ইম্পর্টেন্ট, যে আপনাকে অবশ্যই অনেক স্ট্রাগল করতে হবে এবং একজন কন্টেন্ট ক্রিয়েটর হতে হলে অবশ্যই সেটার প্রতি একটা ধারণা নিতে হবে আপনাকে। সো আমি অবশ্য আজকে একটু বাইরে আছি, একটা মাঠের ভেতরে আছি এলাকারই। সো আজকে এই পর্যন্তই। নেক্সটে কোনো ভিডিওতে অবশ্যই দেখা হবে। চ্যানেলটাকে সাবস্ক্রাইব করে সাথেই থাকুন। ধন্যবাদ।